The sun had barely risen over the dusty horizon of Iraq when the soldiers first set foot on this foreign land. The air was thick with heat and tension, carrying the scent of sand, metal, and something darker. They had trained for years, studied maps, memorized strategies, and prepared for combat. But nothing could prepare them for what they were about to face. This was not just a war of bullets and explosions. It was a war that would seep into their very minds, a war that would haunt them long after they left. From the moment they arrived, the atmosphere was unnerving. Streets that should have been bustling with life were eerily silent. Abandoned cars, broken windows, and shattered walls told a story of chaos and fear. At night, the quiet was even more terrifying. The soldiers would lie in their tents, listening to sounds that made no sense. Distant footsteps on empty streets, whispers carried by the wind, shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every rustle of the wind or clatter of debris made their hearts race, reminding them that danger was never far away. Their first days were a blur of patrols, briefings, and careful observation. They moved through dusty alleyways, always alert, always scanning for threats. And it wasn't just the enemy they had to watch out for. Iraq had its own ways of testing them: heat that burned their skin, sandstorms that blinded them in an instant, and a sense of unease that settled over them like a heavy blanket. Every corner could hide danger, and every shadow seemed alive. The soldiers began noticing strange things almost immediately. Objects that should have been still would occasionally shift when no one was near. Shadows appeared in the corner of their eyes, only to vanish when they looked directly. Some reported hearing whispers in a language they couldn't understand, words carried by the wind but filled with a tone that made their skin crawl. These were not the ordinary stresses of war. They were moments that seemed to touch the supernatural, moments that planted seeds of fear that would grow with each passing day. Even the locals seemed to contribute to the growing unease. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about cursed places and spirits that lingered where blood had been shed. Soldiers would hear these stories while on patrol, and though they tried to dismiss them as superstition, a part of them could not shake the feeling that there was some truth to these tales. Every abandoned building, every darkened alley, every deserted street seemed to hold a secret, something waiting, watching, and maybe even following. The soldiers' minds began to play tricks on them. Fatigue, stress, and fear mingled until reality itself felt fragile. One night, a soldier swore he saw a figure standing silently at the edge of the camp, only to find nothing there moments later. Another heard a child's laughter echoing through an empty street, chilling him to the bone. Even the bravest among them could feel the creeping dread, a sensation that grew heavier with each passing hour. And yet, they pressed on. Each day brought new challenges, new threats, and new reminders that in this war, danger was never just physical. It was mental, emotional, and deeply personal. They quickly realized that surviving Iraq was not just about fighting the enemy. It was about confronting their own fears, facing the unknown, and navigating a landscape where the line between reality and nightmare was constantly blurred. This was just the beginning. These first days in Iraq would mark the soldiers forever. The sights, the sounds, and the unseen horrors they encountered would stay with them long after the war ended, shaping their memories and haunting their dreams. Every soldier carried a story, and some of those stories were so terrifying that they could shake even the strongest mind. As the sun set over the barren landscape, the camp settled into an uneasy silence. The wind whispered across the desert, carrying with it the echoes of battles yet to come. The soldiers knew that they had entered a world far more terrifying than they had imagined, a world where danger lurked around every corner and nightmares could come alive in the blink of an eye. Little did they know, the most terrifying experiences were yet to come, experiences that would test their courage, their sanity, and their very will to survive. And tonight, under the darkening sky of Iraq, the shadows were already waiting. The days that followed were even more intense than the soldiers had imagined. Every patrol felt like walking into a trap, every corner hiding the possibility of an ambush. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them. Rugged streets, crumbling buildings, and shifting sand that made it easy to lose one's bearings. The sun blazed down mercilessly during the day, and at night the desert air turned bitterly cold, making sleep a rare and precious commodity. Despite their training, the soldiers began noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Footsteps echoing behind them when no one was there. Strange markings on walls that seemed to appear overnight. Even the animals behaved strangely. Dogs would bark at empty streets, and birds would suddenly fly away as if warning of something unseen. The soldiers tried to rationalize it all, blaming fatigue, nerves, and the stress of war. But deep down, an unease was growing that no explanation could erase. One evening, during a routine patrol, Sergeant Miller felt a chill run down his spine. The team was moving through a deserted market area, the remnants of a once bustling place now reduced to ruins. Broken stalls and shattered pottery littered the ground. The wind carried the faint sound of someone or something moving among the debris. "Stay sharp," he whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But when they turned the corner, nothing was there. Just shadows, just silence. Private Alvarez, one of the younger soldiers, started mentioning dreams that felt like memories but weren't his. He would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking, insisting he had seen the ruins filled with people who weren't really there. His friends tried to comfort him, but they too had begun noticing the strange occurrences. Soon whispers in the wind weren't just imagined. They seemed to form words, sentences, warnings that sent shivers down their spines. The soldiers began documenting every strange event, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. Every unusual sound, every flicker of movement, every feeling of being watched was carefully noted. Some nights they would gather in the tents and share their experiences, realizing that many of them were seeing the same things. It was no longer just fatigue or paranoia. They were experiencing something inexplicable, something that seemed to exist alongside the war itself. One night, while on a scouting mission, a group of soldiers came across an abandoned building that gave them all an uneasy feeling. The doors were intact, but the windows were shattered, and the interior was dark and foreboding. Inside, they found remnants of a life abruptly interrupted, children's toys, cooking pots, and clothes scattered as if the inhabitants had vanished in an instant. But it wasn't the emptiness that scared them. It was the feeling that something was still inside, watching, waiting. Corporal Jenkins, who prided himself on being fearless, froze in the doorway. "Do you feel that?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. The team nodded, each soldier tense, their hands gripping their weapons. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind them, echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. Something skittered across the floor too fast to see clearly. Everyone's heart raced. They had faced enemy fire, explosions, and the chaos of battle, but this was different. This fear wasn't born of war. It was something older, something darker. Back at the camp, the soldiers would talk about what they saw and heard, but no one wanted to admit how deeply it was affecting them. They had trained to endure physical pain, but the mental strain was harder to fight. Shadows that moved without explanation, voices that whispered without speakers, and the feeling of constantly being watched. It all started to weigh on them. Sleep became a battleground, and the line between dream and reality blurred. As days turned into weeks, the stories became more intense. Soldiers described seeing fleeting figures that vanished when approached, hearing cries of fear in empty streets, and witnessing unexplained phenomena that defied reason. Even the seasoned veterans began questioning their sanity. They knew the enemy was real, but now it seemed like something else was present too. A presence that did not belong to this world, something that thrived on fear and uncertainty. The strange occurrences were not limited to nighttime. During the day, objects would inexplicably move. Weapons left on tables would shift positions. Radios would emit static, and then faint voices that no one could identify. The soldiers couldn't ignore it any longer. They realized that whatever was happening, it was growing stronger, bolder, and closer. The desert that seemed so open and endless suddenly felt like a cage with invisible walls pressing in from every side. Yet, despite all this, the soldiers carried on. Each patrol was a test of courage, each mission a challenge to maintain their focus and sanity. They were no longer just fighting an enemy they could see. They were confronting the unknown, the terrifying, and the inexplicable. Every day in Iraq was a new story of survival, a new brush with the shadows that lurked at the edges of reality. And though they had yet to fully understand what they were up against, one thing was clear: the horrors of war were not limited to bullets and bombs. Iraq held secrets, shadows, and experiences that would haunt the soldiers for the rest of their lives. Something was waiting in the ruins, something patient, something that thrived on fear, and the soldiers knew that the longer they stayed, the more they would come face to face with it. By now, it was no longer just a mission. It was a fight to preserve their minds as much as their bodies. The desert was vast, the streets were treacherous, and the nights were alive with unseen terrors. But they had no choice but to keep moving forward, to face whatever awaited them in the shadows of Iraq, knowing that the next encounter could change everything, forever. The days in Iraq felt longer and heavier than ever. The soldiers had started to realize that the danger was not only from the enemy, but also from something they could not see or explain. Every patrol was full of tension. Every corner of the dusty streets and ruined buildings seemed to hide eyes watching them. Even when the sun was shining, shadows seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense. One afternoon, Sergeant Miller led his team through a narrow alley in an abandoned part of the city. The buildings were broken and crumbling. The air smelled of dust and smoke, and the wind carried strange sounds like whispers, faint but clear enough to make their skin crawl. Private Alvarez stopped suddenly, pointing to a doorway. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Everyone looked, but there was nothing, just an empty doorway. Still, the feeling that someone or something was there stayed with them. That night, back at their camp, the soldiers tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. Every noise in the dark tent made them jump, the rustle of wind, the snapping of branches, the distant cry of a dog. Alvarez could not stop shaking. "I swear I saw a shadow move on its own," he said quietly. The others nodded. They had all felt it, the strange presence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was as if someone or something was always just behind them, watching, waiting. The next day, the team went on another patrol. They entered a neighborhood that had been completely destroyed. Buildings were hollow shells, with windows like dark eyes staring at them. As they moved through the streets, they found signs that made their stomachs turn. Toys were scattered on the ground, but they were old and dusty, as if abandoned years ago. Plates were still on tables, but they were cracked and covered in dirt. Clothes were strewn across the floor. It was like everyone had vanished in a hurry. But vanished into what? Then, something happened that made all of them freeze. A loud noise came from inside one of the buildings. A deep thump, like something heavy hitting the floor. Everyone raised their weapons and carefully stepped inside. The air was thick, dusty, and still. They could see broken furniture and papers scattered everywhere. But then they saw it. A shadow moved across the wall. It was fast, too fast to be a person. The soldiers shouted, but when they looked again, nothing was there. Corporal Jenkins, who had always been calm, finally admitted he was scared. "I've seen explosions, gunfights, all kinds of battles. But this is different," he said, his voice shaking. No one disagreed. It was not human. It was not a known enemy. It was something strange, something that belonged to another world, something that fed on fear. The soldiers tried to leave the building quickly, but the strange things didn't stop. Outside, the wind seemed to whisper words they couldn't understand. Objects moved slightly, almost like invisible hands were touching them. Radios crackled with static, and for a moment, faint voices could be heard. Voices that seemed to call their names. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to slow them down. That night, the soldiers huddled together in the tent. They talked about what they had seen, what they had heard, and what they had felt. One by one, they realized that it was not just the war that was dangerous, it was something else. Something that had been in these ruins long before they arrived. It was patient, silent, and always present. The fear that had started as small unease was now growing into terror. Alvarez could not stop thinking about the shadow he had seen. "It's like it's following us," he said quietly. Miller nodded. "It's here," he admitted. "And it's watching. I don't know why, but it doesn't want us here." The team felt the truth of it. This was not just a haunted building or a creepy story. This was real. Something was in Iraq. Something that soldiers had stumbled upon by accident. Something that had been waiting. Over the next few days, strange events became more frequent. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. Doors would slam shut on their own. Cold air would suddenly fill rooms, even when the sun was blazing outside. Sometimes they would see a flash of movement, something fast, dark, and impossible to identify. Each soldier started to feel on edge all the time. Their nerves were stretched thin. Even the most experienced soldiers were afraid to be alone. The team tried to keep a sense of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every patrol was filled with tension. Every ruined street was full of uncertainty. Every shadow seemed alive. And yet they had to keep moving. They had to complete their mission. But deep down, they knew that whatever was in those streets was waiting. It was patient, and it was growing bolder. One day, the soldiers were sent to check another abandoned area. As they approached, a feeling of dread filled the air. It was heavier than anything they had felt before, like a dark cloud pressing down on them. They entered a building, and immediately the strange noises started: whispers, thumps, scratching sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls. The soldiers gripped their weapons tighter. Every instinct told them to run, but their training forced them to move forward. Inside, they found something that made them stop in their tracks. A wall was covered with strange symbols, lines and circles that made no sense. Some were drawn in dirt, others seemed to be etched into the plaster. It was not human handwriting. It was something else, something ancient. And in the middle of it all, there was a small, dark shadow that moved independently. It flickered in and out of sight, almost teasing them, daring them to come closer. The soldiers felt fear like never before. They knew they had entered a place that was not safe. This was beyond the normal horrors of war. This was something older, something that had been waiting for them long before the first gunshot was fired in Iraq. They realized that they could not fight it in a normal way. Their weapons were useless against it. Their courage was tested in ways that went beyond physical battles. By the end of that day, the soldiers were shaken. They returned to camp exhausted, but the fear did not leave them. They shared stories of what they had seen and heard, and everyone agreed that they were not imagining it. Something was there in Iraq, something terrifying, something that had claimed the abandoned streets as its own. And the soldiers knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. The presence in Iraq was patient, quiet, and always watching. And the soldiers had no choice but to face it, knowing that every step forward could bring them closer to the unknown horrors that lurked in the shadows of the war-torn city. The next day, the soldiers woke up with a heavy feeling in their chests. None of them had slept well. Everyone was quiet, staring at the walls, remembering the shadows, the whispers, and the strange symbols they had found the day before. Sergeant Miller tried to keep everyone calm, but even he could not shake the feeling that something was following them, something they could not see but could feel. Their orders were clear. They had to check another sector of the city. It was supposed to be routine. But when they arrived, the streets were different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, and the shadows were darker, stretching across the rubble like fingers. Even the wind felt colder, cutting through their uniforms like invisible knives. Private Alvarez was the first to speak. "I don't like this place," he said, his voice trembling. "It's wrong." No one argued. Everyone felt it, an uneasy pressure that made the hair on their arms stand on end. They moved through the ruins carefully, weapons ready. The buildings seemed to whisper to them, the wind carrying faint voices that sounded almost human, but were not. Every step made their nerves tighter. The soldiers were no strangers to fear. They had faced explosions, gunfire, and enemy ambushes, but this was different. This fear had no source they could fight. Suddenly, Corporal Jenkins froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked. The team went silent. A low, guttural growl echoed from one of the buildings. It was not loud, but it sent shivers down their spines. The sound was deep, unnatural, and full of menace. They approached the building carefully. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the shadows seemed to move on their own. Something heavy and dark shifted across the floor. Alvarez swallowed hard. It's not human," he whispered. Sergeant Miller signaled for them to spread out. They entered slowly, scanning the room. The walls were covered in strange symbols again, some scratched into the plaster, some drawn in dirt on the floor. The symbols seemed to move when they looked away, changing subtly as if alive. And then it happened. From the far corner of the room, a shape emerged. It was dark and tall, but its movements were strange, jerky, unnatural, like it was not bound by the rules of this world. Its eyes glowed faintly, red like embers, and it stared at the soldiers without blinking. The air grew colder, and their breaths came out in clouds, even though it was the middle of the day. Alvarez froze in terror. What is that?" he whispered. The shadow moved closer, gliding over the floor silently. It did not walk. It seemed to float, as if the ground itself would not hold it. The soldiers raised their weapons, but their bullets would not reach it. It passed through the air as if it were not real. The creature let out a low, echoing roar that shook the walls. The soldiers felt it in their bones. It was more than just a sound, it was an attack on their minds, filling them with fear and dread. Some of the soldiers felt dizzy, like the room was spinning. Private Alvarez dropped to his knees, gripping his head, screaming, "Get it out of here! Make it stop!" Miller tried to keep calm. "Fall back. Everyone fall back," he shouted. But as they turned to leave, the shadow blocked the doorway. It had anticipated them. Its glowing eyes followed every move. The soldiers were trapped, and the fear was crushing. In a desperate move, Jenkins grabbed a flare and lit it. The bright red light filled the room, and the shadow hissed. It recoiled for a moment, but then it surged forward, faster than before. The soldiers ran, using the flare as light, hearts pounding. Every corner they turned, the shadow was there, moving silently, gliding, appearing and disappearing like a nightmare. They reached the open street, gasping for air. The sun was still out, but it felt dimmer. The shadow did not follow them outside, but they could feel its presence, waiting, watching. Alvarez leaned against the wall, shaking. "It knows we set. It sets, waiting." Miller nodded, his face pale. "We sip seen it now," he said quietly. "We know it sip's real, and we need to be ready, because it sip's not done with us." That night, around the campfire, the soldiers tried to make sense of what they had seen. They talked in low voices, each story more terrifying than the last. Every sound made them jump. The snap of a branch, the rustle of a tent, the whisper of wind through the sandbags. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow inside the tent felt alive. Every corner seemed to hold the figure they had seen. They realized that this was not just a haunted place or a trick of their minds. Whatever it was, it had been here long before the war. It had been waiting, and now that they had seen it, it would not let them forget. It was patient, intelligent, and terrifying. The soldiers began to change. Their confidence from past battles was gone. They were more alert, more nervous, constantly scanning the skies and the ruins. Every mission became a fight, not just for survival, but against something they could not see, something that seemed to exist in another dimension. One night, as they tried to sleep, a strange, cold wind blew through the camp. The whispers came again, clearer this time. Names were called soldiers' estate names. The sound was almost human, but warped, broken. Alvarez sat up, frozen with fear. "It sips here," he whispered. "It sips right outside." Miller grabbed his weapon and motioned for silence. The team listened. The wind blew again, carrying the whispers, the footsteps, and something else, a dragging sound like claws scraping the ground. The soldiers held their breath. The darkness outside seemed alive, moving toward them. They realized that their nightmare was far from over. Whatever they had encountered in the ruins was not just a shadow. It was a predator, patient, intelligent, and terrifyingly real. The soldiers knew one thing for sure. They were no longer just fighting a war. They were fighting to survive something far older and far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. The next few days were a living nightmare for the soldiers. They tried to continue their missions, but everything felt wrong. The streets they walked through seemed different each time, as if the city itself was shifting, changing to trap them. Buildings that were empty before now had shadows moving inside. Every corner seemed alive, watching them. Private Alvarez began hearing whispers even when no one else was around. At first he thought he was imagining things, but the whispers became clearer, calling his name softly, sometimes urgently. He would freeze in place, staring at walls, trying to catch a glimpse of who or what was speaking. The voices were never friendly. They were always mocking, threatening, as if feeding on his fear. One night, the soldiers were resting in an abandoned building. Sergeant Miller was trying to keep everyone calm, but even he could not hide his unease. The air inside the building felt thick, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a loud banging echoed from the walls. The soldiers jumped to their feet, weapons raised, but there was nothing there. Then they noticed the floorboards moving. Something heavy was dragging itself just beneath the surface, creating a rhythm of scratches and thuds. The sound moved closer to them, with every passing second. Private Alvarez whispered, "It's under us. It's under the building." His voice shook, and no one knew how to respond. Suddenly, the walls seemed to pulse, almost like they were breathing. A faint red glow appeared from cracks in the plaster. The soldiers exchanged terrified glances. None of them had ever seen anything like this. They had fought battles against human enemies, but this was different. This was something supernatural, something that defied all reason. Then, without warning, the ceiling above them groaned and cracked. Dust rained down as a shadow moved across it, stretching its long limbs toward the soldiers. It didn't drop from the ceiling, it almost seemed to float, gliding through the air. The soldiers fired their weapons, but the bullets passed right through the figure as if it were made of smoke. Private Jenkins screamed as the shadow lunged toward him. He stumbled back, his flashlight falling to the ground and spinning, casting wild beams across the room. The soldiers felt the air around them grow colder, and their breaths came out in clouds, even though it was not cold outside. The shadow hissed, a sound that made everyone's stomachs turn. The soldiers realized this was no ordinary fight. They couldn't fight it with bullets or knives. This thing fed on fear, and the more terrified they were, the stronger it became. They had to think. They had to be smart, or they would be consumed. Sergeant Miller shouted, "We need to move. Stay together and don't look away." The soldiers backed toward the exit, keeping their eyes on the shadow. But the hallway ahead seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly. Every step they took felt like moving through thick mud, and the shadow followed silently, gliding over the floor. Private Alvarez tripped over something, a small, strange object. It looked like a cow skull, but much darker, almost black. It stared at him with empty eye sockets. He screamed, and the shadow froze for a moment. The soldiers realized that these objects were not random. They were warnings, maybe even traps. As they ran, the shadow vanished suddenly, leaving only silence. But the soldiers knew it was not gone. They could feel it just out of sight, waiting, watching, planning its next move. The air was thick with tension, and no one spoke. Even the wind outside seemed to whisper, carrying fragments of voices that sent chills down their spines. That night, the soldiers tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow seemed to twist and move. Private Alvarez refused to close his eyes, afraid that if he did, the shadow would appear right in front of him. Even Sergeant Miller, the bravest among them, could not hide the fear in his eyes. Strange things began happening to their gear. Weapons would disappear and reappear in impossible places. Radios would crackle with whispers they could not understand. Footsteps echoed in empty streets. The soldiers realized they were no longer just fighting a battle in the city. They were fighting something that could reach inside their minds. One evening, while scouting a ruined building, the soldiers found symbols on the walls again. These symbols were different this time, more complex, almost like a language. Private Jenkins touched one carefully, and a sudden scream filled his mind, echoing like 1,000 voices. He collapsed, shaking, screaming, unable to control himself. The soldiers tried to help him, but they were powerless. The shadow was not just attacking their bodies. It was attacking their minds. Fear and confusion became weapons in its hands. Each of them began seeing things that were not there. Shapes moving in the corner of their eyes, whispers coming from empty spaces, and shadows that followed them even in daylight. They realized one horrifying truth: this entity was patient. It didn't need to strike all at once. It could torment them slowly, breaking their minds before breaking their bodies. And the soldiers had no idea how to stop it. Every strategy they tried failed. Every trap they set was ignored. By the end of the 5th day, the soldiers were exhausted, physically and mentally. Their confidence had vanished. They were no longer the warriors who had entered the city. They were terrified, paranoid, and haunted. Each of them began to wonder if they would ever leave this place alive. Sergeant Miller gathered the team and whispered, "We SIP's seen what it can do, and its SIP's not finished. We have to find a way to survive, or it will take every one of us." As night fell again, the wind carried the familiar whispers. The dragging sounds returned, closer this time. The soldiers huddled together, weapons ready, knowing that whatever was out there was smarter, stronger, and hungrier than anything they had ever faced. And they were the prey. The next morning, the soldiers gathered in a ruined building, trying to plan their next move. They were tired, scared, and their nerves were stretched to the breaking point. No one spoke at first. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the occasional whisper carried by the wind. Sergeant Miller took a deep breath and said, "We can't keep running. That thing will hunt us until it's done. We need a plan, a way to fight back." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the fear he felt inside. Private Alvarez spoke up, his voice trembling. "We SIP tried everything. Weapons don't test work. Even hiding doesn't help. How do we fight something we can see or touch?" Miller looked around at his team. He knew they were losing hope, but he refused to give up. "We fight smart, not with guns, not with brute force, but with what we know. It sits hunting our fear. If we can stay calm, maybe we can trap it, maybe we can outsmart it." The soldiers nodded, although none of them fully understood what outsmarting a shadow that could slip through walls really meant. But hope, even a small spark, was better than nothing. They began scouting the area for a place where they could set a trap. They needed somewhere they could control, somewhere the shadow couldn't escape. After hours of searching, they found an old, abandoned warehouse. Its walls were thick, its windows boarded up, and the entrances limited. It seemed like the perfect place to make a stand. Inside the warehouse, they started preparing. They used every piece of equipment they had: ropes, wires, even debris from the building. The soldiers created barriers, traps, and alarm systems. Anything that might slow the shadow down, anything that might give them a chance to fight back. Private Jenkins placed symbols he had found earlier on the walls. He wasn't sure why, but he remembered seeing them in other buildings. Maybe the shadow feared them, maybe it didn't, but it was worth a try. He traced the strange shapes carefully, feeling a chill run down his spine with every stroke of the chalk. Hours passed, and the tension was unbearable. Every noise outside made the soldiers jump. Every shadow in the corner of their eyes seemed to move. Sergeant Miller tried to keep everyone calm. He reminded them to breathe, to stick together, and to trust the plan. But deep down, he knew that their minds were already being tested, stretched to the limits by days of fear and isolation. As night fell, the warehouse grew darker and colder. The soldiers could feel the presence approaching. The familiar dragging sound echoed in the distance. Then the whispers began, calling their names, taunting them, mocking their fear. The shadow was near, and it knew they were ready for it. Miller whispered, "Remember, stay calm, don't let it feed on your fear. We've got this." But even as he said it, he doubted himself. This was no ordinary enemy. This was something that could bend reality, twist minds, and slip through walls like smoke. The shadow appeared suddenly, gliding silently over the floor. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness. It seemed to pause, sensing the traps, sensing the preparation. It hissed, a low, terrifying sound that made the walls vibrate. The soldiers held their positions. They did not move. They did not blink. They waited. The shadow lunged. Dust and debris flew as the first trap was triggered. Ropes tightened, wires snapped, and barriers fell. The soldiers watched carefully, noting every reaction from the shadow. It recoiled for a moment, a faint scream echoing through the warehouse. Then it vanished again, only to reappear on the other side, testing their second trap. Private Alvarez gritted his teeth. "It sits learning. It sits learning how we set the traps." Miller nodded. "Then we adapt, we adjust, stay focused." For what felt like hours, the soldiers engaged in a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Every trap slowed the shadow, but it never fully stopped it. Every strike they made, every barrier they set, the shadow seemed to anticipate. But the soldiers did not give up. They worked together, communicating in whispers, coordinating movements, and staying just a step ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to corner the shadow near the center of the warehouse. It hissed and shrieked, moving faster and faster, but the traps held. The soldiers watched with bated breath, knowing that this was their only chance. Miller shouted, "Now!" Don't hesitate. They activated the final trap. Ropes and wires tightened, surrounding the shadow completely. It screamed, a sound that made their ears ring and their stomachs churn. For a moment, the shadow struggled, as if fighting with everything it had. Then, slowly it began to fade, almost like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. The soldiers did not relax. They kept their positions, watching carefully as the shadow disappeared completely. The silence that followed was deafening. They were alive, but shaken. They had survived something beyond comprehension. Miller looked at his team. "We did it, but this is only temporary. It sits out there somewhere, waiting, and it will come back if we let our guard down." The soldiers nodded silently. They knew the truth. They had won a battle, not the war, and the terror they had faced in the warehouse would haunt them forever. The warehouse was silent now, but the air felt heavy, almost alive. The soldiers could still hear faint whispers in the corners of their minds, like the shadow had left a piece of itself behind. Their muscles ached, their hearts pounded, and every sound made them jump. But they knew they had to keep moving. There was one last thing they had to uncover. Miller led the way to the center of the warehouse, where the shadow had finally disappeared. The floor was scratched, blackened, and smelled like burnt metal. In the corner, partially hidden under debris, they saw something that made their stomachs turn: a severed cow head, perfectly preserved, its eyes wide open, staring at them as if it were alive. Private Jenkins stumbled back, gagging. "It was waiting for us here. All this time, it was guarding this." Miller stepped closer, his boots crunching on broken wood. He knelt down and carefully touched the cow head. There was something strange about it. It didn't smell like a normal carcass. It almost felt cold, unnatural. His fingers brushed a mark etched into the forehead, one of the same symbols Jenkins had drawn on the walls. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the warehouse, and the shadows in the corners started moving again. The cowhead's eyes seemed to flicker, almost alive. Miller grabbed his flashlight and shone it directly at the head. For a moment, the soldiers saw it, something inside the eyes moving, like a tiny figure screaming silently. Private Alvarez whispered, "It sits not just a head, it sits a vessel. That shadow, it sits using it, storing a part of itself inside." The realization hit them like a punch. Everything they had faced, the moving shadows, the whispers, the terrifying encounters, they were only seeing part of the true horror. The shadow was far more powerful than they had imagined. It could live inside objects, manipulate fear, and strike without warning. Jenkins swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "So, even if we destroyed it here, it could come back through something else." Miller nodded slowly. "Exactly. We haven't beaten it, we just trapped it for a while. But this head, it sets a warning. It sets, showing us what it sets capable of, and we have to leave before it finds another way to get to us." The soldiers looked around nervously. Every creak, every shifting beam of the warehouse made them jump. They knew leaving wasn't safe, but staying was even worse. Carefully, they gathered their gear and the cowhead, wrapping it in tarps and chains. They moved slowly, silently, every sense alert. As they reached the exit, a low, chilling whisper echoed behind them. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape." The hair on their arms stood up. The sound was everywhere, inside the walls, inside their heads. Miller didn't look back. He pushed the team forward, every step heavy but determined. Outside, the night was dark and quiet. The city seemed normal, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But the soldiers knew the truth. They had survived the shadow. They had survived the cowhead. But the fear would never leave them. They had seen what evil looked like, what it could do, and what it could become if ignored. And deep down, they knew it wasn't gone forever. Miller finally exhaled, looking at his team. "We Sits are alive, but this isn't Sits over. We Sits will have to live with this knowledge, and we Sits will have to warn others. Nothing like this should ever be left unchecked." The soldiers nodded in silence. They didn't know if anyone would believe their story, but they knew one thing for certain: the terror they had faced in that Japanese bunker, the shadow and the cowhead, it was real, and it would haunt them forever. As they walked away into the night, the wind carried a soft, almost playful whisper. Until next time. And somewhere deep in the darkness of the abandoned warehouse, the shadow waited, patient, silent, and hungry for fear. The soldiers finally reached the edge of the city, but their hearts were still pounding. The night around them was quiet, almost too quiet. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, and every rustle of leaves made them jump. They could feel the weight of what they had discovered in that Japanese bunker pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Miller set the cowhead down carefully on the back of their truck. He didn't touch it more than he had to, but he couldn't help looking at it one last time. The eyes, they still seemed alive. Watching, waiting. Do we destroy it?" Jenkins asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miller shook his head slowly. "We can sit, not yet. Whatever that thing is, destroying it might make it angrier or worse. For now, we take it somewhere safe, somewhere we can study it. But no one, and I mean no one, can know what we found. Not yet." Alvarez looked around nervously. "I keep hearing it whispering, like it sits inside my head now." Miller clenched his jaw. "That sips the danger. It feeds on fear. It wants us to panic, to make mistakes. We can sit, give it that. We have to stay calm, stay together." They drove in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, remembering the horrors inside the bunker, the shadows that moved on their own, the sudden cold that cut through them, the whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. And of course, the cowhead, that unholy thing. Hours passed, but the city around them remained eerily quiet. Miller finally pulled over at a secluded location he knew would be safe, an old military storage facility far from anyone. They unloaded the cowhead carefully and locked it in a steel containment box, covering it with chains and seals. As they stepped back, a breeze blew through the area, carrying with it a faint whisper. "You can set hide, you can set run." The soldiers froze, but Miller took a deep breath and said, "We stir not running, we stir surviving. And if it comes back, we stir be ready." Even though they tried to appear calm, none of them slept that night. Every shadow in the storage facility seemed to twist and move. Every creak of metal sounded like a warning. And in their dreams, the cowhead stared at them, its hollow eyes filled with silent malice. The next day, they left the facility and went their separate ways, but the fear stayed with them. Every dark corner, every flickering light reminded them of the bunker, the shadows, and the cowhead. They had survived, yes, but the terror they had faced would never truly leave them. And somewhere, far away, the shadow waited, patient, silent, watching. Because fear, it knew, never dies. It only waits for the next moment, the next victim, the next story. Even now, if someone were to wander near the abandoned Japanese bunker, they might hear a whisper on the wind, a warning, a reminder that the nightmare was real, and that some horrors, no matter how far away, never truly end. The soldiers had fought, they had seen the unthinkable, and they had survived. But deep down, they all knew one terrifying truth. The shadow was still out there, and it was hungry for fear.